Hey guys, this is Benny Ricciardi with rotocurve.com. It's Friday before the next week, week 3 of NFL DFS, and I'm here to bring you our sleeper picks based off the ownership percentages that we saw from Thursday night on sites like Fantasy Aces, Fantasy Feud, and FanDuel. Remember, Fantasy Feud is running a $1 million tournament at the end of the season for their NFL DFS product. What they're doing is running qualifiers. They have qualifiers for the high end at the 525 level, and also some cheaper qualifiers at like the $33 and $55 level, so that they have something for everybody at every price point along the spectrum. It's the third company that's offering $1 million prize this year, and the one that I think a lot of people aren't talking about. A lot of those qualifiers have overlaid, so make sure you get over there and sign up over at Fantasy Feud. If you use the code CURVE when you sign up, you'll get a $25 bonus into your account, and you'll also get a 100% deposit bonus on whatever your first deposit is. So it is a really good deal over there, so make sure you get over there and sign up for it. The idea of this sleeper and ownership video is to look at the ownership rates that we saw from the Thursday night lock games over on FanDuel and Fantasy Aces and Fantasy Feud, and try to figure out which guys are going to be sleepers, which guys are going under-owned by the community, and which guys can give you that big upside that you need in a tournament to kind of differentiate your rosters. Now, one thing I want to make sure everybody understands is if you look at the winning rosters on a weekly basis, you do not need to have a whole bunch of guys in your roster that are low owned. You still want to play some of the chalk picks. You still want to play some of the guys that are highly owned. You just want to make sure you pick the ones that do have the best games. Now, what you want to do with these low ownership guys is sprinkle one or two of them in there in a position where you like these guys or the upside that these guys could have better than you like the upside of some of the guys that are highly owned. You want to try to fade a few of the highly owned guys, use a couple of the other ones, and then sprinkle some of the low owned guys in there to make your roster different than the rosters that everybody else is putting out. As hard as it is to win a tournament when your entire roster is filled with chalk picks, it's just as hard to win a tournament when your entire roster is filled with, low owned flyers. The idea is to find a nice balance of the two and hopefully wind up with a very high-scoring roster. So we're going to go position by position, talk about the guys who the community has used the most, and then try to talk about some of the guys who are under-owned based on, the numbers that we saw from Thursday games. So starting at quarterback this week, there is really only one guy that's incredibly highly owned, and that's Tom Brady. On the $2 FanDuel tournament from Thursday night, Tom Brady was close to 25% owned. In the $1 tournament, he was actually closer to 28% owned. So he's taking about a third of all the money, a quarter to a third of all the money that's coming into the pool is coming in on Tom Brady. Now, they do have the highest total. He is, somebody who plays on a team that really has been passing the ball an absolute ton. They don't run all that much at New England. I actually saw a stat yesterday where Tom Brady actually has 15% of the designed runs that New England has run as a team so far this year. And we know that Tom Brady is not somebody who they're doing designed rollouts for. So those designed runs have been like quarterback sneaks on 3rd and short or something like that. But the fact that he has 15% of their total, designed running plays so far this year tells you just how little they are running the ball. So I do still think that he's going to be throwing it around a lot. Now, for cash games, I really don't think that he's somebody that you want to fade. Remember, we don't want to fade highly owned guys in cash games. If a guy's highly owned, it's probably because he's a chalk pick, and it is somebody who you want to use in your cash games. But for a tournament, there is a lot of merit to fading him. If Brady doesn't have a huge game this week and 25 to 30% of the field is on him, if you decide to, use somebody different and fade him, you're going to wind up putting yourself ahead of, a third or a quarter of the people that you're going to be able to knock out of most of these tournaments. There are a lot of options at quarterback that are lower owned, with him being the only guy that was over 10%, besides Eli Manning, who actually played on Thursday. So with him being the only other guy that was over 10%, you're going to be able to get some pretty low ownership on any of these other quarterbacks. So if you pick the guy that does go off, you're going to be one of 7 or 8% of people that have him, and probably put yourself in a really good position to win a tournament. So if Tom Brady is not your top quarterback on the week and you have somebody else that you like, basically everybody's in play here. You had guys like Carson Palmer and Cam Newton that were about 7% owned. Roethlisberger and Russell Wilson were about 6% owned. Aaron Rodgers and Andrew Luck were 5 and 3% owned. And Ryan Fitzpatrick was 2% owned. Those are some of the guys that I've been looking at to put into my rosters. The thing I really like about Luck and Rodgers is Luck, Rodgers, and Brady are all in the same price range. So if people are gravitating over towards Tom Brady, that's going to leave guys like Andrew Luck and Aaron Rodgers much lower owned, because those are the three guys that are at that price range. So if people have that price to spend up, you can tell that, basically almost everybody is gravitating towards Brady in that situation. So you're going to be able to get guys like Luck and Rodgers lower owned. They both play in very high over-under games this week too, with 48 totals. Both guys are favored. So it is a pretty good situation to look at some of those guys and try to build some rosters around them. With the way that people link guys together as well, when you take a quarterback and some of his pass catchers, you're also going to get some high ownership on all the New England guys that are linked together with Tom Brady this week. That also means you're going to get a little bit of a lower ownership on the guys on Green Bay and Indianapolis who aren't being linked with their quarterback, since their quarterback isn't being used as often. Just keep that in mind when you're building rosters and looking for some of the pass catchers that you have. If you want to use New England guys, you're probably going to be paying, you're probably going to be part of a large group of people who do have them. If you want to use some of the guys on Green Bay or some of the pass catchers on Indianapolis, you're probably going to get them at a lower ownership rate than they really should be. So moving on from the quarterback spot, talk about running backs right now. I was a little bit surprised to see how high Le'Veon Bell's ownership was. He was 18 to 25% in some tournaments this week. Now, I'm not saying I don't like Le'Veon Bell, because I actually do, but there is a case to be made that he might not be the top running back on the week. I think D'Angelo Williams is still going to get a couple carries in that game. Pittsburgh does like to pass the ball, which, again, if you're playing on a site like DraftKings where he gets the full PPR, Le'Veon Bell is actually a really good play because he's very involved in the passing game. But if you're playing on a site like FanDuel or another site that has a half PPR kind of thing, it's not as important, those 4 or 5 catches that he makes. Yes, it's nice that you get a couple extra points, but it's not going to be a huge bonus to you over there. So there is merit to going away from him. Definitely more merit on a site like FanDuel than there is on a site like DraftKings. But if you're playing on a half PPR site, there are other guys you can look at. Now, the 3 guys that are in that price range with Le'Veon Bell are Bell, Peterson, and Marshawn Lynch. Peterson was 11% on the Thursday lock games, and Marshawn Lynch was about 8 or 9% on the $1 and $2 Thursday lock games. So you're basically getting Peterson or Lynch at half the ownership rate that you're getting Le'Veon Bell with. If you like Peterson or Lynch, Peterson had 31 touches last week. Lynch is playing in a game where everybody expects Seattle to be up and to be running late, and that's the kind of game at home where Marshawn could pick up a couple touchdowns. And if he does pick up a couple touchdowns, he's going to pay off that salary for you and give you a really good day. So I think instead of using Le'Veon Bell this week, I'm going to be underweight Bell compared to everybody else and probably try to up my percentages of guys like Peterson and Marshawn Lynch, which will give you more bang for your buck, considering that they're both closer to 10% than the 20% that Le'Veon Bell is. Dion Lewis was somebody who really surprised me. I did hear New England come out this week and basically say they're still going to be, looking to pass the ball, even if they are winning and even if they are up, they're still going to have a pretty pass-heavy game plan this week. So I think that's why so many people moved over to Dion Lewis. I heard a lot of people talking about LeGarrette Blount earlier in the week, and I was one of those people who said to you guys that I still think Lewis is going to be somebody who's going to see a lot of work here. Brady loves working out of that shotgun. He loves being able to survey the field, run that hurry-up offense, see where the mismatch is and get the ball out there. And Blount is not anywhere near the pass catcher that Dion Lewis is. And Lewis is a serviceable runner, especially if they're not going to be running the ball a ton. Basically the good thing about Lewis is when he does run the ball, it's usually when Brady sees that the team is playing back and there's only, 5 or 6 guys up in the box. And at that situation, he'll check down from, whatever pass play they have. He'll audible to a run play. And Lewis usually is able to find some room to run, especially without a lot of linebackers sitting there to make the tackle. So he's a guy that I'm a little bit on the fence with. I liked him because I thought he was going to be low owned when everybody was talking about LeGarrette Blount. It turns out that Blount was 2% owned, and Dion Lewis was 18% owned in most of the Thursday lock games. So if you do think that this is a game that's a quote-unquote LeGarrette Blount game, you're going to be getting rewarded if you do decide to use him. If you're using Dion Lewis this week, his price has come up, and now his ownership is up as well. So you're not going to get as much bang for your buck. He's not going to be that low-owned 4 or 5% owned guy who really differentiates your roster this week. He's going to be one of the chalk plays. So that's something that you want to consider in a tournament. I'm probably going to have less exposure to him than I originally thought, and I may actually add in another, LeGarrette Blount roster or two, because at that low ownership, if it does wind up being a game where they decide to keep it on the ground and let Blount run in the second half, there's a good chance that he could be low owned and be a differentiator for you. Jamaal Charles was at 12% today, so he's actually higher owned than Adrian Peterson and Marshawn Lynch is, which makes absolutely no sense to me. I would not take Charles over them. Maybe there's a little more merit to it on a site like DraftKings where you get the PPR. But if you remember last week, he actually got his touchdown vultured by Niall Davis. And Davis is somebody who does get some carries. I would rather have a guy like Adrian Peterson, who you know is going to get the lion's share of the carries in that game. And, you don't have to worry about somebody stealing or vulturing his touchdown from him. We also have Danny Woodhead was 9% owned as well. This is another guy that I think I'm going to be fading this week. I like when you can get Woodhead at 4 or 5%, and he has a little bit of upside and all that. But last week, you actually saw Melvin Gordon in there in the red zone a little bit. They actually kind of both had a couple red zone looks. But week one, it was all Danny Woodhead in the red zone. So it looks like they're giving Gordon a little bit of a bigger role. And Gordon actually had a pretty good game last week. He broke a couple good runs for 15 or 20 yards. He's a guy that does have that kind of upside. His huge upside is limited because he's not in there on passing downs. He's basically a first and second down kind of back. As long as Woodhead's still on the team, Woodhead's going to be in there for not only third downs, but what people don't realize is at the end of a half, in the second half, if the team is losing, when they go to that passing offense, when we say a third down back, it doesn't mean that guy only plays on third down. At the end of a half, when the team's running a hurry up, Danny Woodhead's the guy that's going to be in there during the hurry up. Melvin Gordon's going to be on the bench. So there are big chunks of the game that he's not going to be in there. So that does kind of tick him down a little bit. But he could be a sneaky play this week because he did run very, very well and looked really, really good last week. Some of the low-owned guys, there are three guys that I wanted to talk about because they're all in the same price range, and it's going to be a decision that everybody's going to have to make when they're making their rosters. You got Devonta Freeman, James Stark, and Joseph Randle, who are all 6,500 over on FanDuel this week. Now, Freeman is 5%, Stark is 4%, Randle is 4%. We still don't know about Eddie Lacy yet, which is why Stark's 4% is a little bit surprising to me. If we do get Lacy news before this weekend, I have a feeling Stark's ownership is going to go through the roof, especially over on DraftKings where he's only a minimum $3,000. Anybody who does have some open space in their roster or an open flex position, if the games start and then we hear about Eddie Lacy being out afterwards, anybody who has some guys that they didn't like in their roster or somebody who they wanted to pay up for to get, I think they're going to go and make that switch and put in a guy like James Stark at minimum price and be able to upgrade whoever they took out of their flex and whoever, whatever running back or quarterback or wide receiver position they did have open. So I think you're going to get a really huge ownership rate on James Stark. Excuse me. I think you're going to get a huge ownership rate on James Stark if we do get that Lacy news before this weekend. If we don't get that Lacy news, I think his ownership might be a little bit less on FanDuel, but again, you're taking a big risk because you're not able to take him out of your lineup. On DraftKings, you can put him in, but the problem is it's a Monday night game, as we discussed in the running back video. So if you put him in there on Sunday and, you wait till Sunday night and all of a sudden Monday we find out Lacy's in, you're really not leaving yourself with too many swerves. If you have him in the flex spot, the easiest swerve to make would be to go over to a guy like Richard Rodgers at 2,500, the tight end from Green Bay. Or, as I said yesterday, if you put him together with Aaron Rodgers on DraftKings, that's $11,000, which is also the same amount of money as Alex Smith and Travis Kelce would cost you if you decided to make that switch as well. So it is just something that's out there, something I wanted you guys to consider. I still think I would rather, even if I had Rodgers, unless I was really behind and I really needed to do something to differentiate a roster and give me big upside, catch a bunch of people in front of me who I thought did have a guy like Rodgers on their roster, I would probably still go with Aaron Rodgers and Richard Rodgers. But if you do need to come from behind, or if you're in a head-to-head and you think the other guy has Rodgers over there, it would be a good idea to probably switch off to Alex Smith and Travis Kelce, although I got to be honest, it's not my favorite play altogether. I do like Kelce a lot. Alex Smith is not somebody who I would use unless it was in this situation. So while it's not ideal, it is something to look at. So we got Devonta Freeman, who's going to be taking over for Tevin Coleman. He should see a lot of touches. He actually saw 13 in the first game with Coleman active. He saw 16 in the second game, with Coleman getting probably 8 to 10 touches before he went out anyway. So you could see 20 to 25 touches here for a guy like Devonta Freeman. He does contribute in the passing game. He does have some pretty decent hands. He was actually a guy who they were mixing in on passing downs already, even when Coleman was healthy and playing. So he is somebody that you can look at. At his price of 6,500 on FanDuel, I'm not a huge fan of him because I just don't see the upside. I mean, he would really need to get you a touchdown and wind up with like 100 and something yards. And to be honest with you, he's not a guy who I'm really looking at to get 100 yards this week. If he does it, he's going to do it because of volume. He's not going to do it because of talent. He's not somebody who's going to break a 60 or 70 yard run. He's not somebody who's going to have 4 or 5, 15 or 20 yard runs. You know, he's a 3 to 5, 6 yard kind of back. That's basically what he does. He'll help you move the chains a little bit. He'll make a couple catches for a couple yards as an outlet. But he's just not, he doesn't have that home run kind of talent. So just keep that in mind. The other guy at this price range is Joseph Randle. Now, Randle is another guy who I don't think has huge upside, but I think Dallas is going to really, really try to keep the ball on the ground and try to control the clock and try to run a lot in this game. They're missing Romo. They're missing Dez. Witten looks like he's going to play, but I mean, he's got 2 bad ankles and a bad knee. I mean, you know, this guy's a warrior, but you can't expect a huge game out of him either. Brandon Whedon's the quarterback right now. You got Terrence Williams and, you know, Beasley and Street. I mean, it's just not an ultra talented offense at the moment. So I think they're going to try to play it safe. They're going to try to slow the game down. They are going to try to run as much as possible. So I do think you're going to get the volume with guys like Randle and Freeman. If Stark is in there, though, he's probably my favorite play out of all of them. A couple other guys that are low owned I just wanted to mention. Carlos Hyde is only 2.5%. He was very low owned in week 1, went off. Week 2, everybody was on him because he went off in week 1. He got hurt. And then when he came back in the game, basically there was nothing, you know, there was no reason for him to come back in the game after he got hurt because they were already down. The game was already decided. So they just decided to keep him on the sidelines. But he's been practicing in full all week. He's completely healthy. He feels good. And he's probably going to see the lion's share of the carries again in this one. So his ownership was down to 2.5% on the Thursday lock games. His price was a little expensive over on FanDuel at 7,800. I think he'll be a little bit higher owned at DraftKings, where his price is a little friendlier. I think he's like 5,100 over there. But again, he's somebody who I think is flying under the radar and is expected to see huge volume because Reggie Bush is still out, and he's basically going to be the running back, you know, on first and second down, and also can catch a couple passes. Will probably be in there for some third down work as well. And the other guy who I want to mention is Justin Forsett. Now, everybody was using Forsett last week, and people started hopping off him because Lorenzo Taliaferro got the goal line work last week. And if Forsett's not going to get the goal line work, he's really not somebody that you want to put in your roster. The problem is Taliaferro hadn't practiced so far yet this week. If he is out on Sunday, then Forsett is going to go back to being the every down back. He was only 3% on the Thursday lock games over on FanDuel this week. So if you can get Forsett at 3% without Taliaferro there to vulture the touchdowns, I think he might make a decent play this week as well. Moving on to wide receivers, I am going to be fading Julian Edelman this week. And it's not because I don't like him or I don't believe he's gotten an absolute ton of targets through the first 2 weeks. But on FanDuel Thursday lock games, he's 34% owned. Now, a lot of that, like I said, has to do with Brady and people linking Brady and Edelman together. But at 34% owned, here's the idea behind it, and here's why you do this. If you fade Edelman, let's say Edelman makes a catch over the middle, gets cracked by the safety, and on the first play of the game, he's out on the sidelines. Not that I want to wish injury on anybody, but this is the NFL. It's a big boy league, and stuff like this happens all the time. You know, New England could get up big, and he might not have had a big first half. So there are reasons and there are ways that he could not have a big game this week. If he doesn't have a big game this week, with 34% ownership, you're knocking out 1/3 of the field right away. Now, with that 1/3 of the field that you're knocking out, let's say he does have a big game and you weren't on him. Well, even if he has a big game and you are on him, you're not guaranteed to put yourself into a position where you're going to cash. If 34% of the people have him, still at least 14% of the people who didn't have him are, you know, or 14% of the people who did have him aren't going to cash anyway. Only the top 20% cashes. But if you have a chance to knock out, you know, 34% of the field on a bad game, I think it makes a lot of sense not to use a guy like this and to completely fade him all day on Sunday. So that's the way I'm going to be going about it. If Julian Edelman has another big game here, well, you know what? So what? He's going to be the guy that beats me. But I'm pretty comfortable trying to go away from him and trying to find another way up there towards the top if he's going to be 34% owned. The second highest owned guy is going to be Antonio Brown, who was at 27% on the Thursday lock games. And I want to talk about him and Julio Jones here together. Now, I do like Antonio Brown this week more than I like Julio Jones, but Jones is only 9% owned and Brown is 27% owned. I don't think Brown is somebody who you can completely fade, but I don't think I want to have 27% exposure to him. So if you're somebody who runs 10 rosters out there and something like the Millie Maker or the Sunday Millions on FanDuel, if Brown is 27% owned and I like him a little bit less than I think the rest of the field likes him, I may have him on 1 or 2 rosters. So I would have, 10 rosters, I would have a 10 or 20% exposure to him. Whereas if you're somebody who loves Brown and you think 27% is too low for him, you're going to want to put him on 4 or 5 of your rosters and have 40 or 50% exposure to him. This way you have more exposure or less exposure to a guy based on the field, based on how you feel about him. And that's the way you should look at a lot of these ownership percentage things. Now, I don't think there's a huge difference between Antonio Brown and Julio Jones. So I think I would rather have a couple more rosters with Julio Jones in it than I would with Antonio Brown. And since they're the same price, I think it's going to work out pretty well for you if you do that. Next thing I want to talk about, let's see, who's the other guy up there? Larry Fitzgerald is 22% owned on the Thursday lock games. Now, I know he had a big game last week, but I just feel like this is people chasing. John Brown is 5% on that team, and Brown actually has a little bit of a better matchup this week than Larry Fitzgerald does, and Fitzgerald is more expensive. At 22%, I'm going to be completely fading Larry Fitzgerald too. It seems like everybody is chasing the points on that one, and it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me that, 2 weeks ago, everybody was talking about how this guy's washed up and he's a scrub. He has 1 3-touchdown game and now 22% ownership based on 6 or 7% ownership in the past weeks on him. I just think there's way too many people on him. And again, he's another guy that I think you can fade. And if you do fade him and he does have a bad game, you're knocking out about a fifth of the field overall. If you have Edelman and Fitzgerald have a bad game, you're basically going to be in the top 50% of rosters if you fade both of those guys and neither one of them really comes through and has a big game. Other guys to talk about, Brandon Marshall at 17%. I really like Marshall this week. I love his matchup. I think it's a good thing. So a guy like Marshall, I want to have more exposure than the field does. So if I'm playing 10 rosters, I really like Marshall. I would have him on 3 or 4 lineups, to be honest with you. Dante Moncrief, another guy that I really like. His price is very friendly this week all over the place because remember, all these things came out before the Monday night game, before we saw him have another good game and basically be Luck's favorite target last Monday against the Jets. So he's 14% owned, 6,000 on FanDuel. I think he's like 4,600 on DraftKings, where I think he might be even higher owned. But again, I really like Moncrief this week. So he's another guy that, if I'm running 10 rosters, I'm going to want to have him on 3 or 4. So I have more exposure than the field does because he's somebody that I think is in a really good spot this week and could do something well. Manny Sanders is another guy I like. He's 10% owned. I think that's about where Sanders should be. I like him a little more than I think the field does, but I don't love him. So he might be a guy that if the field is on him 10%, again, you're running 10 rosters. Instead of having him on 1 roster, I'd probably have him on maybe 2. A little bit more exposure than the field, but he's not somebody I love, so I wouldn't go crazy with it. On the low-owned side, remember, like we said, with Brady being so high owned, you're going to get his pass catchers, guys like Edelman, guys like Dion Lewis, guys like, Rob Gronkowski. They're all going to be very highly owned. But with guys like Luck and guys like Rodgers, you're going to get their wide receivers at a little bit of a cheaper price. Randall Cobb is only 5% owned this week. So I think I'm going to have more exposure to Cobb than the field does. I do think that that's going to be a good game that has a lot of passing in it for Green Bay, especially if Lacey's not in there. I think they're going to lean on the passing game a little more. So I would probably look Cobb's way for a couple more rosters than the field is. John Brown, another guy, 5%. Like I said, I think I'd rather use him at 5% than Larry Fitzgerald at 22. Gives you more bang for your buck, helps you differentiate your roster a little more. Michael Crabtree is a guy who's very interesting to me. He had a big week last week, is only 3.5% owned in the Thursday lock tournaments. And if you think about it, in that matchup with the Browns, you're probably going to have Amari Cooper and Joe Hayden on the one side. So the path of least resistance for his quarterback is going to be to look Crabtree's way on the other side. I think Crabtree at 3.5% owned is a little bit under-owned and is getting slept on. So he's definitely somebody I want to have some exposure to in my roster. Jordan Matthews is 2.5%. He's not going to be lined up with Revis the entire game. I know people think that. And Revis is actually in danger of not playing in this game as well. So Jordan Matthews is one of the top receivers. He's a guy I had on most of my teams in the first 2 weeks. His price has gone up a little bit, but I do think there's a little bit of merit in using him as well this week. AJ Green at 2%, another guy that I think has more upside than people are giving him credit for. I don't love that Baltimore pass defense. I think their rush defense is a lot better. So I think Cincy is going to be looking to pass in that game. AJ Green at 2%, definitely somebody I want to consider. Other guys like Kendall Wright and Steve Smith are 2% as well. I think people are thinking that Wright is going to get matched up in a bad matchup with Vontae Davis this week, but Wright plays more in the slot, and they move him around a lot too. My problem with Wright is that he hasn't seen a ton of targets yet this year. I think he had like 5 or 6 in the first game and then like another 4 or 5 in the last game. Granted, the first game turned into a little bit of a blowout, so they didn't need to use him all the way. But I can't use a guy that's only going to get 4 or 5 targets. I mean, if I'm going to use a guy with 4 or 5 targets, I'm going to use Travis Benjamin, who I absolutely hate and everybody keeps asking me about this week. But at least he's got that long ball home run ability. Wright is more of like a slot type kind of receiver who catches like the slant passes and the short stuff. And, basically I think that unless I knew he was going to get more targets, I don't think he'd be somebody I wanted to use. But I did want to mention him because his ownership was low. And like I said, Steve Smith is probably going to have a tough matchup with Leon Hall. He's a good receiver. I don't think Baltimore is going to throw it as well as they did last week, so I'd probably be off of him as well. Moving down to tight end, you got Rob Gronkowski, who's going to be very, very highly owned. He was 27%. Tyler Eifert was 10%. I think 27% is actually low, a little bit lower owned than I would use Gronk, though. I'm going to have Gronk on probably close to half my rosters. So if he's only 27% of the field, I have no problem putting him on half my rosters and having 50% ownership of him because I think I like him more than the field does. So I want to be overexposed to a guy like that. Eifert, I will not be using at all at 10%. I just think that there are other guys who are less owned than he is that I like for a little more upside. Mainly Travis Kelce is one of those guys. At only 6%, I'm going to have a lot of exposure to Kelce here. Jimmy Graham was 7%. I'm not a big fan of him. I think his price is too high. I don't think he sees enough targets. I know everybody's saying, well, he complained about not seeing targets, so they're going to target him all that much this game. But the game script, if you really think about it, is Seattle's going to go up big, and they're going to wind up running. I don't think they're going to go out of their way to give 10, 12 targets to Jimmy Graham today. And that's really what you're going to need in order for him to pay off his price. So I know everybody's talking up Jimmy Graham. I just feel like it's a trap this week, and I'm not going to be on him. Another guy who's really low owned that I do kind of like is Eric Ebron. With Pettigrew out, he is basically seeing 70 to 75% of the snaps at tight end. So I think he's somebody that I do like. Caught a touchdown in the last 2 weeks. Does have a lot of targets so far through 2 weeks. So he's another sneaky play. Very cheap. I think he's $5,100 on FanDuel. It's like $3,300 or something like that on DraftKings. So he's a guy with some upside that I do like as well. Last guy I want to mention who's less than 1% owned is Kobe Fleener. And again, this is if you saw my tight end video for this week, it basically hinges on, Dwayne Allen not playing. But last year when Dwayne Allen missed a couple games, Kobe Fleener had 2 games where he put up like 20, 25, fantasy points. And if we're going to get a game without Dwayne Allen, all that tight end stuff that the two of them usually split is going to be consolidated into Fleener. And I think that Fleener could have a much bigger game if that's the case. Now, moving on to defense, the last thing to talk about here. Seattle defense is 18%. The Jets are 15%. The Broncos are 12%. The Patriots are 11%. Those are the top 4 owned defenses and the 4 defenses that I mentioned in my defense video. So I completely agree with all of that. Now, thinking about it on the ownership rate here, I think that Seattle is the nuts. Like, clearly the nuts. They're going to be my defense in, basically all my cash games this week. So if they're only 18% owned, I actually feel that's low owned for them. I thought they would be closer to 25 to 30%. And at that rate, I was thinking, all right, 30%, I think you got to fade them. But if they're only 18% owned, I don't think you really have to fade them. I think that you can put them in a lot of your rosters because I think everybody else is thinking, well, they're going to be so highly owned, I got to fade them. So let everybody else take defenses that are in worse spots. You got the Seahawks 0-2 with their backs against the wall, going home to Seattle, facing Jimmy Clausen, the backup quarterback, probably without Alshon Jeffries, his number 1 receiver, in a game that has basically the lowest, the Bears have the lowest implied Vegas total. I mean, if you told me to script the perfect situation for a defense that you would want to take, this is the situation. I mean, they have everything going in their favor. They got their, emotional leader, and Cam Chancellor is probably going to be back in the game and playing this week. It's just, to me, it's just like the perfect storm. So I expect this defense to have a really big day. And if people are trying to get away from them thinking they're going to be too highly owned, the fact that they're only like within 5 percentage points of the Broncos and the Jets and the New England Patriots, that tells me that they're not as owned as much as I thought they were going to be, and they're not as owned as much as they should be. So I would have no problem rolling Seattle, even in the tournament. I don't think that they're too highly owned that you have to stay away from them. I think that there's better than a 1 in 5 chance that Seattle is the best defense this week. And if they're only 18%, that's less than a 1 in 5 chance that the field is giving them. So I want to be overexposed to that defense in that situation. The one defense that's a little bit of a long shot that I would be looking at is the Houston Texans. I think that they can put some pressure on and pick up some sacks, and they're only 4% owned, which to me is just way too low for the Texans defense. I figured they would be like somewhere around like the 10% range, maybe a little bit lower owned if the Seahawks took 30 or 40% of the defensive field. But if you can get the Texans at only 4%, I think that there's a lot of upside there. The Buffalo Bills are 3%, the Browns are 3%, Miami's 1%. So that's basically the rundown on some of those for the defenses if you're looking there. But for me, I definitely think I want to be overexposed to the Seattle defense, meaning if everybody else is on them in 20% of rosters, I probably want to use them in 30 to 50% of my rosters. So again, you're running 10 rosters, the field would be on them in 2 and 10. I want to be on them in, like 3, 4, or 5%, 3, 4, or 5 of my 10 rosters. I think that is a really solid play and a really solid way to play it. So that is our ownership and sleeper pick article for the week. Basically you can see the article. We're going to attach it underneath here. It has some of the ownership percentages that we noticed from the Thursday, some of the high-owned guys, some of the low-owned guys. And remember, like I said, the idea here is not to put together an entire roster of chalk plays, but it's also not to put together an entire roster of guys that are, 3 to 5% owned. What you want to do is pick out the guys who you think are the best plays, and then pick out the guys who you think have the best chance to not live up to their potential, and then try to find a low-owned guy at that position that you can put in instead. So if you're somebody who doesn't think Le'Veon Bell or doesn't think, Gronkowski is going to have a big week, well, that's the guy that you choose to fade. But if you're fading 1 or 2 of those guys, that's usually enough differentiation in your roster that you can still go and pick some of the chalk guys for the other positions. It's okay to have a couple chalk guys in your roster. The reason why they are chalk guys is because they are in such good spots. So if you're going to completely fade all of them, you're kind of missing the point of what we're doing here. The idea is you still want to put together the highest scoring roster, and the guys that are chalk are going to be the guys who have the best chance to be the highest scoring guy on the week. So you want a couple of them in your roster, but you want to round out your roster with guys that are going to be lower owned. If you go and put together like a cash game kind of roster where you take Antonio Brown and Marshall and Moncrief, and you put, Le'Veon Bell and Latavius Murray, who are high owned, and you take Brady and you take Gronk. I mean, if you have all these high owned guys in your roster, you're not going to differentiate yourself enough in the tournament to really get up to the top. What you want to do is take a couple of them and then put in 1 or 2 of those flyers that you think could have a big upside game based on their price and low ownership. A guy like a Travis Benjamin last week, if you look at some of the winning rosters last week, it wasn't a whole bunch of guys that made no sense. It was a whole bunch of guys that everybody was on and everybody was talking about, but they had a guy like Benjamin who scored 40 points at 1% ownership, or they had a guy like Dion Lewis who was 2 or 3% owned and wound up with 20 or 25 points on DraftKings. That's how you wind up building a roster that has a chance to really take down one of these big tournaments, or even one of the qualifiers, a smaller qualifier, or if you play in a 100-man tournament, it's the same thing. You don't have to go completely off the board, but you also can't go completely chalk. So that wraps up our video. Thank you guys for joining us here at rotocurve.com. And as always, stay classy, DFS.